Yeah, that's nice. Good evening, and good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are watching these events. It's afternoon here in Princeton, so I can say good afternoon, everyone. You're welcome to what promises to be a thrilling and memorable event. My name is Nsukka Okeke Agolo, and I'm the director of Africa World Initiative, the director of the program in African Studies, and Robert Shermer, professor of art and archaeology and African American Studies. You're welcome to the inaugural Africa World Lectures, one of the flagship programs of AWI, the new center established here at Princeton as a platform for repositioning our university's engagement with Africa and African institutions and with stakeholders across science, technology, and innovation, and yes, the arts and humanities. While we are primarily committed to supporting programs and projects on the continent, our remit is also to deepen Africa's presences in Princeton. And one key way to do this is to bring what we consider, in our judgment, Africa's finest minds for a few days to share with us ideas on any aspect of the diverse, complex realities, pasts and futures of the continent and what it means to be African in the world today. The Africa World Lectures is designed, therefore, to offer this platform an opportunity, and I could not imagine a worthier figure to give the inaugural lecture than my friend and sister, and yes, a force of nature, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Let me note that Princeton has played a formative role in the unfolding of Adichie's sterling career as a writer. A few years before the MacArthur Fellowship came, Princeton awarded her the Hodder Fellowship, during which time she was putting finishing touches in one of her amazing novels. The Hodder and Princeton, we can say, opened the gates of acknowledgement for her rising son. And it is with gratitude that we welcome her back to Princeton to join us as we begin what we hope will be, in the coming years, a landmark lecture series. Having enthralled us and commanded the world's attention with 3 multi-award-winning novels in which she told memorable stories about a middle-class Igbo family in post-colonial Nigeria, about life and love in the chilling shadows of wartime Biafra, and about the precarity of contemporary African immigrant experience in racialized subjectivity in the United States, Adichie has earned the deserved reputation as one of the most important storytellers of our time. But if she stayed in her lane and simply wrote path-charting novels and short stories, that would have been more than enough. Thankfully, literature constitutes only but one platform from which she has grappled with art and selfhood, community and representation, history and regimes of domination, and what it means to be African, Nigerian, and Igbo. Whether it is her TED Talks on the importance of resisting colonial and Western narrative singularities, or on reanimating post-colonial feminism and its mandates, whether it is her searing op-eds on the scavenging of the poor by religious institutions and on politics and governmentality in Nigeria, Adichie's voice became and will remain, I believe, inevitable in her home country and on the global arena. The power of her writing is made deeper by the grace of her voice. In fact, the beauty of her work as a writer and her intrepid advocacy for justice and fairness makes me think of her enterprise as the pursuit, indeed the attainment, of an idea captured by the enigmatic Igbo word, mma, which simultaneously invokes aesthetic splendor and ethical goodness. It is this sublime combination, I believe, that has compelled young readers, serious scholars, political leaders in Africa and globally, and equally significant members of our home community in Anambra State, Nigeria, to pay attention to what she has to say in her novels and short stories and in newspaper pages and on social media. It is for these reasons and more that I could not be more honored to welcome Chief Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie Odelowa of ABBA as the Africa World Lectures inaugural speaker. Before she comes to the podium, let me note that after her presentation, we will have a conversation followed by Q&A. And at the end of our program, she will do some book signing just outside of this room. And with that, I present to you Nwanne m Nwanyi, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, to come on stage. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. One is never too sure of getting a warm welcome, so it always comes as a pleasant surprise. Thank you for being here. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to start by thanking Professor Chika Okeke-Agulu for inviting me. Princeton is very lucky to have him. I've always admired his intellect, his unwavering integrity, and even more than his integrity, I've always admired how he holds Africa in the palms of his hands, with thoroughness and thoughtfulness, and always, always with love. It's nice to be back here in Princeton. Years ago, I spent a year as a Hodder Fellow, and I taught a creative writing class. And I enjoyed getting to know my students, and I hope the students here today are as curious and bright and pleasant
as my, as my students were, but perhaps, hopefully, not as savagely focused on grades. I remember on the last day of class bringing in grapes and cheese and crackers for the class, and one of the students said to me that she would always remember me because I had brought the coolest snacks. And so one of my warmest memories is that I think of myself as the bringer of cool snacks. I found this lecture series interesting and appealing because of its goal, which is to invite a lecturer to reflect on the ideas of an Africa-centered world from their own experience as an African in the world. In thinking about this reflection, I thought that perhaps I might speak of the story of my own creativity, with the caveat that I have a contested relationship with the story of my own creativity. There's a lack of clarity and certainty for me in thinking of my influences as a writer. It starts to feel, in some ways, like being your own therapist, which is not really a very pleasant prospect, at least not for me. And so I have sometimes had to invent answers to the kinds of questions that writers are asked about my process, my choices, my characters. And in inventing those answers, sometimes I believe myself, and sometimes I don't. I want today to look at my writing through the lenses of the touchstones of my life, not because I am certain of exactly how they shaped my writing, but because I know they must have shaped it. I knew very early on in life that I wanted to write stories. I also knew very early on in life that I did not want the things I was supposed to want. Both ideas, I think, are connected, correlated, because dissatisfaction with the status quo is a prerequisite for any kind of creation. I am the daughter of two remarkable, kind, and loving people, a professor and a university administrator. And so for me to be in a university anywhere in the world is to feel an immediate sense of familiarity and sometimes of tranquility. Because tranquil best describes my early childhood on the campus of the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. Nsukka was a slow, small, and lovely place. Its decline would come when successive military governments stopped funding education, but my childhood in the early 1980s was the last gasp of the university's sparkling age. At the entrance of campus was a large gate with security guards in uniform, many of them elderly men with gentle demeanors. And before each car drove through, the driver would stop, get out of the car, and open the boot, or the trunk, as I'm now compelled to say in America. Checking cars as they drove in and out of campus was really a symbol of apartness. It said the campus was not part of the larger town, and it really wasn't. It was a world of its own. It had its own churches, one Catholic and one Protestant. It had a children's library, a medical center, a staff primary school, a swimming pool, a tennis court. And when the general electricity was cut off, the campus generators came on. It was a very happy childhood, but I'm not sure that I knew at the time that it was a happy childhood. It seems to me that happiness is something we often recognize only in retrospect. Now, as an adult, I have come to realize that much of the confidence I had in pursuing my desire to write came from the joy and love that was so abundant in my childhood. I like to say that I did not choose writing, that writing chose me. Nobody has expressed my relationship to writing as perfectly as Zadie Smith did in a lecture while speaking of her own relationship with writing. And so I will quote her. I experienced writing as a permanent emergency state, believing if I devoted time to anything else, I would run out of time and then not have the time to write what I felt I had to write. But why this urgency exactly? Nobody asked me to write, and nobody needs those books. I have to resort to a medieval and unfashionable word, vocation. I felt writing was my vocation. The quote ends here. Vocation, an old-fashioned word, indeed, but no less accurate for being old-fashioned. I do not know a time when I was not drawn to story, to human emotion and human motivation, to dreaming and thinking, to living in my imagination. This is all I have ever known, this longing, this sense of being always one step removed, one step apart, and watching the world. I have this memory from childhood, sitting in the back seat of my mother's car as we drove to the market, looking out of the window and suddenly feeling an intense pang of melancholy, because what I saw through the window as we drove were stories, so many stories waiting to be told, and I knew that I would not be able to tell them all. When I was 5, my father was appointed Deputy Vice Chancellor of the university, and he was assigned a new house on campus. And so we moved from 13 Mbanefo Street to 305 Margaret Cartwright Avenue. Before my family moved, the previous occupant of 305 Margaret Cartwright Avenue happened to be, in an odd bit of coincidence that would later gain some significance, the acclaimed writer Chinua Achebe, who was also a staff of the university. I did not think much of this growing up, since university staff moved in and out of university housing, until many years later when my first novel was about to be published here in the US. My editor asked me to tell her about myself. I did. And then I added, oh, by the way, I grew up in a house formerly occupied by one of the greatest writers in the world, Chinua Achebe. And she said to me, her eyes wide, "That is the most interesting thing you have told me about yourself." And so since then, I have resolved to make sure that this is always included in my biography as one of my life's great achievements. I remember the house as it was then, a light blue 2-story house in a large yard, the green hedge of whistling pine, the row of purple bougainvillea, the white lilies that shrank and died each harmattan, and then magically flowered again when the rains came. The yellow roses in the flower bed by my mother's garage, the trees in the back, avocado, cashew, guava, mango, and the tall, lonely oil palm. I remember playing football with my brothers and our neighbors on the lawn, and we used empty milk cans as our goalposts. We also played badminton on the lawn and used a rope as our net, so that we argued interminably about whether the shuttle had gone over or under. I remember the frangipani tree that we climbed and from which I once fell, a fall that left a mark on my arm. And because I am spatially challenged, it is that mark that I now use to tell my left from my right. I remember that the guava tree had a kind of elegant slouch to its branches, and it was on its thickened stem that the white chickens bought in the market were tied before our house help killed them for Sunday lunch. I remember riding my bicycle up and down the slope of Margaret Cartwright Avenue. All the other children loved to go downhill, but I hated the loss of control. And so I went, not fast and thrilled as they did, but slowly, carefully, cradling the bicycle's brakes. I remember the disgustingly flat, oversized cockroaches that crawled in with the rainy season and smelled utterly horrible. We called them American cockroaches. It's true. They were not the usual smaller Nigerian cockroaches, and I'm not sure why they were called American cockroaches, but perhaps it is not entirely unreasonable to label as American anything that is larger than normal. I remember our gardener, whose name was Jomo, watering the plants with a metal watering can, and my brother Oke following him around, listening to Jomo's stories. One day, Jomo told Oke a story that was different from his usual stories about animals. He told Oke that his eyes, Jomo's eyes, were once a different color. They were once red, bright red. Red? Oke asked, a little frightened. Yes, Jomo said, because he had fought in the Nigeria-Biafra War and had killed people, and his eyes had turned red. Red being the blood of those he had killed. But after the war, he had gone through a cleansing ritual where he swore that he had not killed any innocent people, and right afterwards, his eyes lost their redness. My brother must have been about 10, and I about 7, but this story has stayed with me and must have been there in my consciousness when, many years later, I researched and wrote my novel about the Nigeria-Biafra War, Half of a Yellow Sun. When my parents retired from the university about 20 years ago and moved out of the house, I went through a mourning that even now still feels raw. My mourning was less about an actual house than about what it represented, because it was in that house that I began to form a sense of self, and it was in that house that I first began to write. I wrote sitting at my father's desk in his study, or I wrote at the dining table, often first clearing away food flasks and newspapers and bananas and whatever else had been deposited on that hallowed family dumping ground. It was in that house, too, that I began to read. I remember books as physical things, some with covers torn off, spines cracked, others with the stiff and transparent plastic cover from the library. I remember books as mood and place, reading curled up in bed during heavy rains, reading as I ate at the dining table. I remember books as consolation, and I remember books as absolute luminous pleasure. I read everything except for fantasy. The world seemed to me so unknown and unknowable that it felt like an unforgivable evasion to inhabit imaginary worlds while the mysteries of our own world were yet to be fully deciphered. I read Anna Karenina and Water Babies and the Loss of El Dorado at the age of 9. I was 10 when I read Albert Speer's Inside the Third Reich. I read every single romance and crime book that I came across. I loved those books. I had not yet been indoctrinated into the esteemed cult of literary snobbery. I did not yet know of that spurious distinction made between commercial and serious fiction. For me, the distinction was merely books that interested me and books that did not. I was a child with many questions, and I was educated in a system in which questioning was not necessarily rewarded. In secondary school, I always got straight A's in my subjects, which would have pleased any parent. But each last day of term, my stomach would tighten with anxiety, because my teachers often wrote comments about what they termed my lack of respect. And these comments always got me in trouble with my parents. Lack of respect was really my curiosity, my asking questions, my taking delight in intellectual argument, my refusal to accept easy answers, my reluctance to perform a certain kind of exaggerated deference. My teachers, I felt, should not have punished me for this. I suspect that this particular resentment, the sense of self-righteous and sometimes self-pitying unfairness, has propelled some of my writing. I do see now, looking back, that I could very well have been an annoying child. And yet I wish the adults who had formal authority over me had known how to guide my questioning. Many of my questions were about faith, or more specifically about the Catholic Church, because I was raised Roman Catholic and I was immersed from birth into a life of unquestioned ritual. We went to Mass every Sunday, all dressed up, and after Mass, we took a drive to town to buy snacks and newspapers. I was drawn to the rituals of Mass, of benediction. How could I not be? The rich dramatic potential, the mix of pathos and hope, all elements of great literary worth. And fiction is in many ways like faith. It is a leap of the imagination. I asked questions, how, why? I remember asking about limbo, about the Immaculate Conception. And often I was told that there were questions one should never ask. And I recoiled fiercely from this idea, and I still reject it, this idea that there are questions never to be asked. Because creativity is a process in which you ask questions, and the questions might not always lead to answers, but still you ask. My family's Catholicism was moderate but conservative. The African permutation of Roman Catholicism with its subtle and not so subtle disparagement of pre-Christian Africa. To be baptized, for example, you had to choose an English name because the reasoning was English was Christian and African languages were not. There was a Catholic-Protestant divide among us children on campus. It was a mild and unthreatening divide and consisted of arguments in the playground about which church was better. I was nearly always the spokesperson for the Catholic side because I had read big books about the Catholic Church and I could use big words that the other children did not understand. Of course, they did not know that I hardly understood those words myself. While the Catholic-Protestant divide on campus may have been mild, it had darker consequences and darker historical roots. It was a legacy of the competing missionaries who arrived in Nigeria in the later part of the 19th century, primarily the Irish Catholics, the English Anglicans, the Scottish Presbyterians, all of whom divided as they converted. My father's family, for example, having become Roman Catholic in the 1920s, were banned from attending the weddings of their Anglican relatives. And in this way, families were divided and rivalries born. Today, there are parents in southeastern Nigeria who will balk at the prospect of their Anglican daughter marrying a Catholic man, or vice versa. I am fascinated by faith in general, but in particular by the faith that comes hand in hand with colonialism. I am fascinated by the idea of what people believe and what it can make them do. I am fascinated by the difference between being righteous and being right. And I think my first novel, Purple Hibiscus, is about all of these, among others. And speaking of my first novel, before it was published, an editor strongly suggested that I remove the sprinkling of Igbo words in the novel, because the editor said the Igbo words would confuse American readers. Fortunately, I had just read Saul Bellow's novel, Herzog. And so feeling a little clever, I asked the editor, have you seen the many paragraphs of untranslated French in Herzog? Of course, I understand that French is a much more familiar language to the American reader than Igbo is. But they're both languages, both valued by those who speak them. I've always felt that editors generally underestimate the average reader. Readers understand much more than they're expected to, if not contextually, then intuitively. And we do a great disservice to literature when we try to shape a story to what we imagine to be the expectations of readers. I think of all the books I read when I was growing up, books set in Russia, in India, in Kenya. I might not have understood every single cultural reference, but I understood most of them. Turgenev certainly did not have in mind as his ideal reader a girl in southeastern Nigeria, but I read and loved the novel Fathers and Sons. I grew up bilingual, as did almost all the people I grew up with. We spoke both English and Igbo at home. Sometimes we spoke both English and Igbo in the same sentence. But we were not allowed to speak Igbo in school. It was called, with a derogatory tone, speaking in the vernacular. Even the word vernacular was wrapped in shame. I look back now at the absurdity of it and also the great sadness of it. How colonialism's most insidious legacy is its ability to make you denigrate that which is yours. My Nigerian education was exclusively in English. Today, I cannot make a philosophical argument in Igbo because my education did not give me the tools. And it fills me with a sense of sadness to know that Igbo, for me, will always be the language of informality. And so to use Igbo bits in my novel was to show the texture of my world, a world of two languages. I believed it was important to the integrity of my fiction, and perhaps I wanted also to make a political and emotional claim that both languages belong to me, that both languages are fully mine. My father spoke Igbo beautifully. His Igbo was not anglicized like mine, and he didn't throw in English words as my siblings and I did. He was a radiant storyteller. He told stories mostly of his childhood, so often through the years that I came to know the stories myself, and I would sometimes remind him of a detail he had omitted from a previous version. Through my father's storytelling, my grandfather, who died in Biafra during the war, came alive, as did my great-grandmother, a fierce woman who was called a troublemaker. And it is said in my family that I am a reincarnation of her. In those stories my father told, I loved the anecdotes, the proverbs, the wit, the humor. And I would soak them all up, absorb them, store them, and I began to feel a distinct sense of pride about the Igbo culture from which I came. Pride that I came from a wise and humorous and enterprising and just people. And I think there is something in my writing that speaks to this pride, while also refusing to romanticize it. Like most Igbo families, we had a second home in my father's ancestral hometown. And it was to this home, in the village, as we called it, that we journeyed at Christmas, at Easter, some weekends. Our house was an old, rambling two-story building enclosed by cement walls, a red gate, a sandy yard. Once, my mother attempted the planting of flowers in our yard, but some stray village goats made their way into our compound. And these resourceful animals saw in the red and yellow flowers a perfectly colorful feast. And so that was that for flowers in the village. Pythons are considered sacred in my part of Igbo land. My sister told me a story of a python she found curled in my grandmother's outhouse years before I was born. My sister was terrified. But my grandmother, she said, merely walked over and spoke gently to the python, asking it to please leave so as not to scare the children. The python then uncurled itself and slid away. There were many other stories I heard in the village of people who turned into cats or dogs, birds, of people who went to secret nightly meetings at the bottom of the sea. When I discovered years later a genre of writing called magical realism, I felt a kind of resistance to the name because I knew of this world where the so-called magical was not considered remarkable, but merely part of life. The highlight for me of Christmas in the village was the masquerades. The big masquerades appeared in the village with much noise and music and commotion, and children were filled with excitement at going to see them. But girls, I was told, could not see the biggest and most exciting masquerade. Why? I asked. Well, because they're girls. The unfairness of this stayed with me, and I began early to question and to argue about the need to discard the parts of Igbo culture that diminished the humanity of women, that decreed that simply by being born female, you were automatically excluded from so much that was beneficial. You could not inherit property, you could not participate in the most prestigious ceremonies, you could not have an equal say. And my questioning, arguing process remains ongoing. Still, today, to be back in my ancestral hometown is to feel a sense of an almost atavistic belonging. It is quite simply my home. It is where I want to be buried. I like to think that this rootedness to my ancestral hometown deeply informs my writing. This metaphysical attachment to a physical place acts as a springboard for me and enables me ultimately to have the confidence to tell the stories that I want to tell. And so just a little bit of an aside on the question of my ongoing arguing, questioning about changing parts of African culture. I want to quote a great African icon, Thomas Sankara, who said, "The revolution and women's liberation go together. We do not talk of women's emancipation as an act of charity or out of a surge of human compassion. It is a basic necessity for the revolution to triumph." And in place of revolution, I would add progress, justice, even peace. And here's another small anecdote, still on the idea of questioning, arguing process. I once praised a male Nigerian comedian, and I told him that a lot of Nigerian comedy is lazily misogynistic, where the punchline is always some sort of mockery of women, and that it was refreshing to listen to his comedy. And he replied to me and said, "I hope you never see any of my earlier skits." I was very moved by that response, by the grace of it. And I told him that we are not looking for perfection, we are looking for progress. Nobody's perfect. One of the most magnificent gifts we have as humans is the ability to remake ourselves, to unlearn the malignant things we have learned, to improve, to take one small step after another on that journey of progress. I think of myself as a fiction writer who sometimes writes nonfiction. And when my fiction writing is going well, it gives me what I like to describe as extravagant joy. And when it is not going well, there is no greater source of anxiety and depression. Because of its hold on the emotional boundaries of my life, because it is central to my own sense of who I am, my writing is a deeply private act. If I did not have the good fortune today of being published and read, I would be somewhere, unknown, unread, but I would be writing. And yet, it is too simple to claim that writing is a private act, end of story. If it were so, I would write in a diary and put it away in a drawer. I write because I have to. I write because it is my vocation. I also write because I want and hope to be read. And so an audience, or the possibility of an audience, moves writing from the private to a public space. Of all the consequences of this public space that publication brings, the most significant for me is a certain loss of control. You're not in control of how you are read. And you realize the large, gaping gap between how you write and how you're read. After my first novel was published, I was often told by Americans and Europeans that my novel was a political allegory, that my abusive father character represented Nigeria's brutal dictator. Why, I wondered, must my character somehow represent something political? Why must words like socio-political always be linked to my work? Why am I not asked about the interpersonal relationships between the characters? Why am I not asked about love? Obviously, I know the reason. The modern African novel has its roots in the anti-colonial struggle, and so little of African writing is known outside of Africa that the easy response is always to read it first as political anthropology, rather than as a story of human beings. But it does not change the truth, which is that when I sat down to write the father character in my novel, I was not thinking, I shall now write an important allegorical representation of Nigeria's military culture. Instead, a character had come to me with a hushed voice and an almost broken spirit, a teenage girl who was nothing like me and who I wanted to explore. I should clarify that my questioning this was not because I disagreed about my work being socio-political. I agreed that it was. Rather, I questioned it because it seemed to me that some writing was read in this way and others were not. And this distinction was based not on the content of the writing, but on the personal history of the writer. I did not agree with this kind of categorizing because I believe there were not literary judgments, but rather lazy cultural assumptions. Because unless we insist on a very narrow and incomplete definition of politics, what today is not political? In that sense, then, fiction is sociopolitical. All fiction is political. All fiction is anthropology, simply because the writing does not exist in a vacuum. All stories come, even if obliquely, from social and political realities. Whenever I have book events and a Q&A, I can always tell who is studying African literature from their questions. And these are the questions that least interest me. Because of their insistence on everything being post-colonial, because of their deadening preoccupation with theme rather than character, and because of the realization that characters in African novels are not likely to be conceived merely as sources of delight, or that they are too often seen as characters to whom bad colonial things were done. Bad colonial things were done, of course, indeed are still being done. And yet I long for my characters to be seen primarily, as the great Toni Morrison said of her characters, as characters who are unavailable to pity. I agree wholeheartedly that, as Horace wrote, the goal of literature is to instruct and delight. And often the post-colonial studies students do not seem to have the access to the possibilities of the latter, to delight. And I think of this with a kind of wistful resentment when I hear students speak of things like their favorite of Louisa May Alcott's women, or which of Jane Austen's characters was really the most badass. Another consequence of going from the private to the public space with publication is the sudden appearance of labels and the expectations attached to those labels. African writer, black writer, woman writer. The British writer Pat Barker once said that she did not consider herself a woman writer because she did not want to be in the ghetto of women's writing. Does it mean that Pat Barker was ashamed of being a woman? No, but she recognized how heavy with baggage that label, woman's writing, can be. Publication also introduced me to seemingly trivial things as book covers. An acquaintance of mine once said that he would not read Abdul Razak Ghana because he was not interested in magic realism. But he doesn't do magic realism, I said. And this acquaintance then said, well, it looks like it from his book covers. I remember my beloved friend, Binyavanga Wainaina, who told me that men would not read my novel Purple Hibiscus because the cover was too girly. Apparently, men don't read girly books. But Binyavanga had a point, which is that studies have shown that men, in general, read books by men, while women, in general, read books by men and women. Publication also introduced me to a strange sort of purity test that seems reserved for African writers. I have often been asked, why don't you live in Africa? That is full-time, because I do live part-time in Nigeria. And these questions come from people who would never have asked a writer like Samuel Beckett why he moved to Paris from Ireland, the country of his birth, or why he chose to write in French. My complaint, by the way, is not about the denial of differences. Obviously, my experience is very different from Samuel Beckett's. On the contrary, my complaint is about the acknowledgement of differences and the insistence that the same value be given to these differences. And the label of African writer brought to me the expectation that one must necessarily be an activist if one is an African writer. There are many writers I admire who were actively activists. But I do not think that a writer must, because of being a writer, also become an activist. I choose to speak out about social issues not because I am a writer, but my writing gives me a platform, and social issues matter to me, and so I choose to use that platform to speak. And so I do not think that writers should necessarily speak out on political issues, but I also do not think that art or creativity is a valid reason for evading the responsibilities of citizenship. And those responsibilities are to think clearly, to remain informed, and sometimes to act and to speak. Unlike fiction, nonfiction or activist writing comes to me not as voice or mood, but as emotion, often strong emotion. And most recently, it was a mix of emotions, anger and disappointment, and even a kind of heartbroken hurt that made me feel compelled to write an open letter to President Biden about the Nigerian presidential elections that were held in February. I wrote the public letter because I wanted to tell the story of what happened. And telling the story of what happened has become important in a world so eager to deny and distort even recent history. I wrote it to bear witness. I want to bear witness because I can. And because I can, I believe I must. And finally, I would like to end with these words from Cormac McCarthy. Sometimes it's difficult, but you always have this image of the perfect thing, which you can never achieve, but which you never stop trying to achieve. Thank you.
Amazing. How was that? That's amazing. This is why I describe my dear sister as a force of nature. And the way that she gives her lectures, with that voice that calms you and then throws a punch. I can't get used to it. However many years that we have been, together as friends, and that go way back to the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And in fact, I have my own story of Chinua Achebe. I think I might have a better story than moving into a house he left.
All right, tell us yours so we can decide.
Yeah, so I was 12 years old in 1977 or 78, and they were doing their 50th anniversary for the Government College Umuahia, his alma mater. So Chinua Achebe was their biggest star, right? And he came with, yes, a big, fancy American car. And these boys, that lived outside of the campus, like me, saw the American car and followed it, because we hadn't seen anything like that before in our lives. So we followed this car. It gets into the college campus, and here comes this man that we were told was Chinua Achebe. We didn't know who he was, but he had this fancy car. So we follow him into the hall, and at the gate, they wouldn't let us in. Boys from the street couldn't get into this big hall where they were doing their 50th anniversary and so forth. And so we were standing there, Jude and I, and Achebe looks back and, sees us by the door and says, "What are you doing there?" I said, "Well, they won't let us in." And he says, "Let them in." So we enter this hall, we stand behind him throughout the lecture, and that same Chinua Achebe, right, years later, would be professor at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, where I went to school, right, and taught there, and he was one of my senior colleagues there at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. How is that?
I think I'll concede this one.
Good. I knew that I was going to win this. But frankly, the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, was something special.
Yes.
That town of 7 hills, rolling grassy hills, and the campus ensconced within this, veil. And this was the place, because you did mention Biafra here, throughout your lecture, threw them in the story about the guy whose eyes cleared because he confessed, or, to not having killed people. In my childhood, Biafra was quite big. And we were very afraid of the evening sky, the colorful skies of my childhood, even at Nsukka. Why was that? Because we were told, and we believed, that the reason you had these colorful orange skies in the evenings, that was the mark of the blood of those who died during that war. So until today, I'm not really that much of a big, brilliant sky guy, right? But Nsukka really was so important to our formation. And I wanted to see what you think about that environment, that a lot of writers and artists, the most important figures in the Nigerian African world of letters and arts, convened at that university during the war. The Chinua Achebes, the Obiechinas, the Uchokekes, and so forth. That was what made that campus what it was, and became this fount for people like me that started as artists and ended up as, well, what I do here in Princeton, art history. That this was a place that incubated a lot of talents. And I wonder what this You've talked about Nsukka a little bit. How did your generation experience Nsukka as children who are born in this environment?
Chika, I'm going to steal that story about the sky.
You just pay
It's
me.
going to be my next novel.
Yeah, just.
It's going to start with the character looking up at the orange sky and thinking, blood. No.
Yeah.
Nsukka is special, and of course, because we both have personal connections to it, but I think just objectively speaking, it is different. I mean, not only because it's the university in Nigeria that's actually called the University of Nigeria.
Yes.
But also, I think its history is different. Its history, and also its kind of unusual connection to the US rather than to the UK, which was the norm for other universities.
Yes.
I think for us, by the time I was sort of a teenager, Nsukka I think, started its sort of declining role.
Yes.
But at the same time, there was something about being on that campus, something about the proximity to greatness, really, to brilliance, to intellectual curiosity, that I think was just really good for us. And you can tell, really, the kids who grew up on campus, but they're just different. They're just bright.
Yeah.
And we really benefited from, and also there was a safety about it. There was, you grew up not really, fear was not something familiar to us.
Yeah. Now, I think the other aspect to what made Nsukka this productively combustible mix, right, of creativity, the literary, the visual, the musical, the theatrical. And yes, you had the mathematicians, doing their stuff on the other side of campus, but they often strolled to the arts sections. And I remember we had just outside of campus this place called the Ant Hills, and it was, a bar, really, that every Wednesdays, it's actually close to where you lived, on Cartwright. You remember? Yes. And
I was a bit too young to go to Ant Hill.
Yeah, because if you said that you were, I'll call you out, right? Like, nah, you were too young to be at the Ant Hills at the time. But it's that this was a place where anyone could come and write poetry. Some of us, the art students, you first of all go, try to get liberated, right? With a bottle or two before you then try to write your poetry, right? And then deliver it at the Ant Hills. But it's also the place where the best writers on the continent, in the country, came to present original work. And so just being in that environment, you talk about the mourning that you felt leaving the campus. Perhaps mine is such a deep sense of loss of leaving the University of Nigeria and Nsukka under the circumstances that I did in the 1990s. But I think that one of the things that comes through with that is, as you rightly mentioned, the connection to American university system. The University of Nigeria and Nsukka was the first university that was modeled after the land-grant institutions in the US, but it's also that level of curiosity that you didn't find in most British-type education, that Nsukka had that, and that was very, very important. But I want to take you up on aspect of what you spoke a little bit about, and that's about the question of faith and activism, right? As you have told us, you're Catholic, right? You struggled with it, you argued with the church, but it's not like you were doing it, with your friends and at home, right? That you were very vocal. about what the Catholic Church in Nigeria were doing to poor people, right? Now, you did mention that this wasn't because of the fact that you're a writer, but writing provided you the platform. Could you tell us or speak to why you really took this case up? And just to preface, you have situations where in Nsukka, or rather in Nigeria, the Catholic Church would impose heavy levies on bereaved families, right, in order to have their funerals and so forth. But what was the circumstance, right, that led you to that?
I think I'd had my first, I guess we could call it running, with oppressive Catholic hierarchy. So I'd been away for a while. I left Nigeria when I was 19 to come to the US to go to college. Actually, I left Nigeria because I was supposed to be a doctor, and after 1 year of medicine, I fled.
It didn't work.
Yeah, so I came, so the US was sort of my savior. So I came to the US and just, all I wanted was to do anything that was not a science, because I was so sick of the sciences. And so I was in the US for a few years before I went back home to see my parents, and I realized the church had really changed. And women, so there were men sort of positioned at the entrance of the church, and their job was to examine what women were wearing. And so for the sin of exposing your arm, you could be sent out unless you got a shawl. And actually, there were people who had extra shawls to hand to women so they could wrap themselves up. And I was just horrified by this. And so I wrote about it. And I wrote about it thinking, I'm speaking up for the masses. This is wrong. Women are being harassed in church. Sometimes a woman would go to receive communion, and the priest would look at her and be like, that top is sleeveless. You can't get communion. Go back. Yep. But I was shocked by I thought that, people would complain about it quietly. And so when I wrote about it, I thought, right now we can rise up and say no. But no. People actually said, why did you write about it? You should keep it quiet. You shouldn't let people know what's going on. And then, but that passed. But the more, I think, consequential was after my father died. And and to have a funeral, that's when I really started to realize the depth of just, I think, the rot that you. Yeah, it's actually a bit emotional for me, so I don't. But really, just the idea that in order to get a priest to come and bury your parent, you're expected to pay all kinds of things. They just make all kinds of demands on you, and then I started to hear other stories from people that just felt so just utterly unchristian. Families who would say, the priest, on the day of the funeral, the priest said, we owe 10,000 naira more, so he's not coming. But by the way, the coffin is already out there, that kind of thing. Yeah. And I was horrified by it. Yeah.
I will open up the floor for Q&As, but one last question or comment from you, and that's to do with this moment that we live in, right? You're a writer, you're a citizen of Nigeria and the world, and you look at the politics, of today. What do you do, right, as a writer and as a citizen of the world? How do you think about writing in this moment?
I think for me, they're two very separate things. So my fiction writing is really in many ways completely disconnected from anything. It's sort of me floating in the air and being suspended. But the other side, which is the citizen side of me, is that I exist in a perpetual state of rage. It's true. And that I do not want to stop existing in that state of rage. Because I think it's what keeps you, in some ways, at least for me, it keeps me from sort of succumbing to despair. I can't afford despair. I have to believe that there is hope for Nigeria. There are many other things I'm enraged about. Let's not get started about women in the world. But what's happening in Nigeria is quite simple. We had an election in February that was deeply flawed. And we have a person who we've been told is a winner who did not win the election. And, and this has been shown over and over. There's evidence for this. I think that we have a generation of young people who are increasingly disillusioned because they had such faith in this past election. And so for me, it's simply that I am enraged, but also that I am not letting go of hope.
Fantastic. Well, I am not letting go of hope either. And so we should enjoy and really invest in this collective rage about so much that is happening in our world today and hope for the better. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. There's one person there and a second question from this end. Yes, and a third up there.
So while we're taking, just before you ask your question, so I just want to acknowledge the presence. I mean, so in Nigeria, when events happen and when there's a big woman or a big man, people say, we want to recognize the presence of... So I'm going to ask you to let me be very Nigerian today and say that I want to recognize the presence of a man I deeply respect and a man who I think is a beacon of hope, not just for Nigeria, but for Africa. And he's the man who many of us know won the elections in Nigeria. He's here with us, Mr. Peter Obi. I just want to let you all know that he's going to tell me off for doing this because he didn't want it to be known. And he is also an example of that very rare quality in politicians, which is genuine humility.
Yes. Okay.
Hi. So I'm Beza. I've read your books like at different points in my life. I grew up in Ethiopia my whole entire life and came here for college to seek education, like you've done. And I grew up in a house where my dad told me not to study my first language and learn English because that is the language that will help me cross the ocean. And with that reality, I've come here and I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from your books. And I feel this weight that whatever I'm doing here is never going to be enough for Africa because there's just so much pain that is happening there that I don't even understand, me just as a person who's coming from East Africa, that's happening in Central Africa and West Africa and so on. I study computer science, which is a field that if I go back and work right now, won't do much in any way. So basically my question is, I mean, right now at this stage, you have the voice to make maybe like slight changes, but back when you were in my stage, how did you dare to dream? Like, how do you dream about affecting change for something that you love, something that made you? So that's my question.
Thank you for your question. And you know what? I think that the fact that you asked the question says a lot because you are dreaming. When I was an undergrad, that's actually a good question. I don't think I had sort of grandiose ideas of going to save Africa, honestly. I think I just wanted to write fiction, and I was just hoping somebody would bloody publish my book, honestly. But really, what I'm hearing and what I want to kind of address in your question is this idea that one has to do everything. You don't have to. I mean, you don't have to beat yourself up because you don't know what's happening in Central Africa. You do care. At least maybe you know what's happening in one tiny part of Ethiopia, and I think that's enough. I mean, there's something maybe about the generation of young people today who think that they need to have it all figured out, they need to know everything. You don't. And I really think that in the end, what matters the most is a kind of purity of intention. you care, your heart is in the right place, you will figure it out. And I don't agree, by the way, that what you're studying will not be useful in Ethiopia. I think that there's a lot you could do as a computer science major. I also think that it helps to sort of accumulate not just work experience, but a certain kind of social capital before you go back. Because, in Ethiopia, if you go back and you're like, oh, I've just come from Princeton, I have this program there, they'll be like, okay, what can we do? We know that, we know Africa, so let's not even deny it. So really, I think you're on the right path.
All right. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Persis, and my question for you today is surrounding faith and culture. And so you spoke about the Roman Catholic culture in Nigeria, how problematic it was, but then also like connecting faith to fiction or the spiritual practices in your village growing up. And so I wanted to ask, as you became an adult, separating yourself from the Catholic religion, have you gone back to the Bible or Christian tradition to try and work out your faith for yourself? And for Africans who have spiritual traditions, but are also working with problematic colonial tradition like Christianity, do you have any advice for working through that?
Wow. Can I just do maybe one section of this? I was really long. Well, thank you. Thank you for asking that. And to the question about whether I haven't entirely abandoned Catholicism. For people who have been raised Catholic, it's really interesting how it's almost impossible. Even when you reject it, even the rejection of it, and it's intensely Catholic. I mean, you reject the Catholic Church in a way that's intensely Catholic. So that it's really difficult. And I have to confess that I was so thoroughly immersed in Catholicism that for me, I just find it difficult to take seriously any other kind of Christian denomination. This is also part of the arrogance of Catholicism. And so I'm interested in faith, and in general, I really do think increasingly that it's possible that faith can be disengaged from religion, or at least from organized religion. But I also respect and understand the fact that our continent is intensely religious, and that you cannot effect change on the continent of Africa without engaging with religion, especially Christianity and Islam. And so just in thinking but I think it's up to your generation to start to change things for the better. I mean, we can practice a Christianity that is more respectful of who we are. We can practice a Christianity that is less focused on money, because that, in fact, I think is the bane of African Christianity, this kind of crazed prosperity preaching. And there are people who've said, it's because Africans are poor. I don't think so. I think it's because people have chosen to value certain things and not value others. And we can change that, and, faith can be a good thing, I guess. And when people, so I'll tell you this, when people have said, you shouldn't talk about feminism and women's equality because not only is it against our culture, it's also against Christianity. To which I then say, go read about Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
The Christians here will understand. So.
Okay. There's someone at the top.
Odeluwa Ekenem.
Ekenengi.
My name is Rodolfo Okonkwo. I'm so glad I'm here. I thank you for the wonderful lecture you gave. I teach Americana. And my students always wonder about Ifemelu. I know you've had this question many times. How much of Ifemelu were you struggling to make Ifemelu not to be you? And how much of her is in you? Or how much of you is in her? And the other one is, what happened to the TV show? The HBO was supposed to do a series on Americana. We are looking forward to that because what happened to that project? Thank you.
But I have to start by registering my discontent at this excitement around dramatizations of novels. And I understand that it's the norm, but it really can be annoying when people say, congratulations, your book is going to be made into a movie. And I'm thinking it's the book that matters, you know? Why? I want the world to be more excited by books. But anyway, Ifemelu is, I mean, how much, I don't know, I don't know, but Ifemelu is more interesting than I am, is what I can tell you. A very dear friend of mine said to me, you made yourself and took out all your warmth. So, which I wasn't sure I entirely agreed with.
That's right.
I wanted Ifemelu, you know, I wanted Ifemelu. Ifemelu in many ways is a character I like very much, but I think she's also in some ways an experiment in that idea of the female character who does not practice likability. Because I think in so much of literature, there's an expectation that the female characters, they're read differently, that you know, they should be likable. And when they're not, I think the judgment can be really harsh and extreme. And so I think in some ways, Ifemelu is an experiment instead of, can we see if we can maybe be okay with her, even though she doesn't quite do likability? Maybe, I don't know. So I don't know the answer to your question.
Okay, yes. Oh, there's someone with the mic over there. And, okay, and up there.
Oh, thank you very much for your lecture, Chimamanda. I wanted to ask about your character, Melaitus in Half of a Yellow Sun. Ugu, who Melaitus was based on. I know in Africa, like, the houseboy experience varies a lot across different households. But what was your experience growing up with Melaitus, and have you seen him since the publication of your novel?
Thank you, I love that question. So you've actually really read the book. And you also read the dedication. Thank you. That's really the best thing a writer wants is to be read well. So he, actually by the time I was born, he left, so the war ended in 1970, I was born in 1977, and he left at the end of the war, my mother says, and just didn't come back. So I heard about him because my mother would constantly talk about him and how good he had been, how helpful, because he became the house help in Nsukka before the war started, and so when they ran, he ran with them. He sort of went with them. But often when I would hear stories about him, I would wonder what it was like for him, right? So I thought he was helpful to my mother. I wonder what he thought. I would sometimes think, I wonder if sometimes he, was irritated or thought my mother was, horrible or something. And so I started to imagine Ubu. But I think, and of course, growing up, as most middle-class families on the continent, we had house helps, all the time. And, but one of the things I think I admired and respected about my mother was how the humanity of people who worked for her was important to her. And it wasn't really common, And so I think maybe because I was raised with house helps that, we were raised to know we're full human beings like us, it was maybe possible for me to try and imagine the life of a house help, and also to sort of to tell the house help story with agency, because I think class is something that we very often don't really engage with. I mean, we talk about religion, we talk about tribe, but class, I think, is really, really central. And so he's kind of Ubu is my take on him, but also I think Ubu is me. So my brother here who asked about Ifemelu, it's interesting that nobody asks me how much of me is in Ubu. But there's a lot of me in Ubu. Inside.
Great. Yes.
Hello. I'm all the way up here. I was like screaming for your attention. My name is Ella Buanya. I'm from Kenya. I just want to first off start off by thanking you for your presence on this campus, for gracing us with your presence and giving us a beautiful example of African excellence. I think that's something that I have greatly... It's such an honor and a pleasure. I was just telling my mom, and she was like, what? Chimamanda. I was like, she's in Kenya. She's like, what? I'm like, yeah, are you sure? Anyway, that's not my question. I'm also a writer, but I've been always very scared to share my work. I've written a lot of works on victims of war, victims of genocide, particularly in the African continent. I only write about African stories, but I've never experienced any of these events myself. So my question for you as a writer, how do you access the life of the characters that you write about, even though there may be instances where you have not lived the lives that they live? How do you access their lives and develop their stories?
I don't know. I mean, I think I think I'm a very good listener. I really listen, and I'm a watcher, and I watch things, and also I'm a very good eavesdropper, which is an essential skill if you're going to tell stories, but I think maybe it's also just that I like people, and I think I understand people. And so it makes it possible for me to kind of sort of imaginatively live someone's life. So while you're talking, I'm kind of inventing a life for you. And I think I might be 50% right if I told you what I think your life is. I might be. I mean, I'm kind of good at that sort of thing. And but I think it's also that I always start out with characters thinking of them as human beings, by which I mean thinking of them as both flawed, but also as sort of having the capability of magnificence, you know. I mean, I wrote a story about Mr. Trump's wife, and I am not in any way a supporter or admirer of the Trumps. But the New York Times had asked me if I wanted to write a short story about the elections, and it seemed the most unlikely choice, but I kind of wanted to give myself that challenge. And so I went and I did a bit of research about her background, and I wrote a story that people are still telling me that they think I knew her or knew someone who knew her, and I didn't. So I guess I haven't answered your question. So I would just say to you, keep trying. And the other thing is the details matter. It's really important, if possible, stay away from abstractions and focus on significant detail. That always works better.
Tell their stories. Do you feel like there's a duty for you to liberate them in your writing? Because as I read your writing, it's almost as though you were liberating people who had no voice for themselves.
I love that reading. I'll take it. Thank you.
Okay, one last question, yes.
Yeah. Hello, Chimamanda. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eku Promise, and I'm a Nigerian, also a grad student in computer science. So, like, you mentioned something I could really relate to, which is like in your secondary or primary education, like curiosity was not really like rewarded. Like you were seeing like you got some like funny comments and stuff like that. So my question is like, how do we like from an early stage, like primary school, secondary school, like encourage curiosity in the classrooms in Nigeria, like get kids to be like feel free to like say their mind even though it's not like in line with what the teacher is thinks they should be thinking?
Well, I think the first thing would be to stop making tests be about how much you've crammed the textbook, you know. And also, we really need to change teacher training colleges, the curriculum in those places, because the teachers are only giving as much as they were given. And, you know, my daughter did a year my daughter did nursery school in Lagos, and I was just struck by her coming back with reams of notes. You know, she was like 4.5. And I'm like, what is this? You know, there's what we value, I think, increasingly, and it's also I think many of us know parents who are happy to spend money on what they recognize as textbooks, but what they call storybook, they will not spend money on it because they think it's a waste of time. Actually, I think the reverse should be the case. Because, you know, if children read imaginative writing, there's just so much it does for them. So I think the one thing I would change is I would do a lot more storybook in schools. Actually, I remember reading something about Government College Umuahia, speaking of Chinua Achebe's, and I don't know whose memoir it was, but how they had this English teacher who every day they had to read a novel, every single day in school. And no wonder the graduates of that school are all sort of established. And so I think a lot more imaginative writing. And we need to, in Nigeria, for teachers, start to think of respect as being something very different from fear. You know, we think, I think many Africans, maybe not even just Africans, you know, that idea that if a child is suitably afraid, then that means that child is respectful. That's not true at all. That's not true. And I think there's a lot of that that's ingrained in us culturally, and I think it's worth changing. Are you thinking about teaching? Okay. So go and change it. Go and change it for us, please. Please. Because there's so much intelligence in those kids, but you find that a lot of it is squashed. You know, you cram the textbook, and if you write something that's not in the textbook, even if it's thoughtful, go change it for us.
And with that, let us acknowledge our speaker. This is... Yes.